Imagine sitting down to a grand medieval feast, golden candles flickering, a roasted swan glistening on the table, and the sweet smell of cinnamon and cloves filling the air. The food looks glorious. But what if I told you that almost everything on that table could quietly kill you? From spoiled meat disguised with spices to deadly bread laced with fungus. Medieval dining was a gamble with every bite tonight. We're traveling back to a time when there were no refrigerators, no germ theory, and no safety standards, just salt, smoke, and superstition. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's explore the strange, risky world of medieval food and why people kept eating it, even when they knew it might make them sick. If you were to walk into a medieval kitchen, perhaps in the year 1348, at the height of Europe's long and uneasy relationship with food, you would not find gleaming copper pots or crisp herbs laid neatly in a bowl. Instead, you'd step into a world of heavy air and dim light, where the smell of meat, smoke, and something faintly sour lingered permanently. The kitchen was not a place of comfort, but of survival. Everything that came out of it, every loaf, every stew, every jug of ale, was both nourishment and potential danger. To eat in the Middle Ages was to take a calculated risk. There were no refrigerators, no understanding of bacteria, and very little means of preservation beyond salt, smoke, and hope. The people who lived through those centuries did so in constant negotiation with decay. They learned to disguise, delay, and sometimes even ignore the slow corruption that crept into their food. And yet, they continued to eat heartily, feast boldly, and thank God for the meal. However questionable it might have been, food poisoning, though never called by that name, was everywhere. But to understand why medieval people risked it so constantly, you must understand their relationship with food, a relationship built not on luxury, but on endurance. In medieval Europe, food was always scarce. Even for the wealthy, abundance came and went with the seasons. Winter meant dwindling supplies, summer meant spoilage, and spring often brought hunger. Grain, the foundation of every meal, was vulnerable to damp, mold, and insects. A bad harvest didn't just mean higher prices. It meant death. And yet, even in good years, people ate things that today would make most of us recoil. Bread, the most essential food of all, could be dangerous. In Northern Europe, rye was common, but rye was fickle. In wet summers, it grew a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, better known today as ergot. When baked into bread, ergot caused violent symptoms: convulsions, burning sensations, hallucinations, and gangrene. Villages struck by outbreaks often believed they were cursed. Monks prayed over the afflicted, doctors bled them, and priests offered masses to drive out the fire of St. Anthony. No one realized the truth, that the poison was in their bread. For peasants, there was rarely any choice. They couldn't afford to throw away spoiled grain or meat. Hunger dulled the sense of disgust. A stale loaf or a questionable piece of salted pork could mean the difference between survival and starvation. And so, across Europe, people consumed food that had gone just a little too far, trusting that boiling, smoking, or a pinch of herbs might make it safe again. The methods of preservation available to them were ingenious, but imperfect. Meat was heavily salted, packed into barrels, or hung in smoky rafters for weeks. This kept it from outright rotting, but not from changing. The salt toughened it to the texture of leather, and the smoke gave it a bitter edge. When rehydrated in water, it might regain some tenderness, but also release a faint, sour odor. The smell of decay held at bay. Fish was an even greater challenge. Inland towns relied on salted herring and cod brought in from the coasts, sometimes weeks or months after being caught. These fish were so dried and stiff that they had to be pounded with a hammer before cooking. Even then, they were not always safe. In monasteries where fasting rules forbade meat for half the year, salted fish became both a religious necessity and a dietary hazard. To mask these problems, cooks reached for spices. Spices were among the most expensive commodities in medieval Europe. Cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, cloves from the Moluccas. A single sack of peppercorns could be worth more than a cow. But their popularity was not only about flavor or fashion. Spices were the medieval world's best defense against disgust. They covered the smell and taste of meat that had aged too long. A well-spiced stew might contain mutton weeks past its prime, and no one at the table would know. Wealthy households took pride in their spiced dishes. Feasts in noble courts were dazzling in color and aroma. Saffron-stained sauces, sweetened meats, and heavily peppered pies. But behind the splendor lurked the same old problem: storage. Kitchens and castles and manor houses were enormous, but they lacked what truly mattered: a cool, clean, reliable place to keep food. The great larders and buttery chambers were dark, damp, and full of flies. Servants brushed maggots off cheese, scraped mold from bread, and trimmed away the darkest edges of meat. It was an endless war against rot. Illness from food was common, though rarely understood. When someone fell violently ill after eating, the cause was not suspected to be the food itself, but rather an imbalance within the body. Medieval medicine revolved around the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each food was believed to have qualities that could heat, cool, moisten, or dry the body. Pork was cold and moist, beef was hot and dry, and certain vegetables were thought to increase melancholy. Sickness after a meal was thus interpreted as a moral or bodily imbalance, not contamination. The idea of invisible living agents, bacteria, mold spores, parasites, would have seemed absurd. Instead, people believed that illness arose from corruption of air, divine punishment, or excess. If you ate too greedily, too late in the evening, or with too much wine, you were courting sickness. When outbreaks occurred, say, an entire household struck down after a feast, explanations varied. Perhaps the cook had sinned. Perhaps the meat had been touched by a witch. Or perhaps, more reasonably, the stars were to blame. The celestial bodies were believed to influence everything from digestion to disease. If Mars was in the wrong position, a stew that had been safe yesterday might make one violently ill today. Even the utensils of the time contributed to risk. Dishes were made of wood, porous and hard to clean. Knives were communal, used by multiple diners and rarely washed. Food was served from shared bowls, and hands were the main instruments of eating. Water, which might have been the logical tool for cleaning, was itself often unsafe. Rivers carried human and animal waste. Wells were shallow and easily contaminated. Many people drank ale instead, mildly alcoholic and therefore safer, but it was still brewed in vats that might harbor the remnants of earlier spoiled batches. In cities, the situation was worse. Markets were crowded, noisy, and filthy. Butchers slaughtered animals in the open, their blood running down cobbled streets. Fishmongers sold their wares beside piles of offal, and bakers reused the same sacks again and again. Food regulations existed. London, for instance, had ordinances against selling putrid flesh or stinking fish, but enforcement was rare. If you wanted to eat cheaply, you took what you could find and prayed it would sit well in your stomach. The medieval poor, paradoxically, often fared better than the wealthy when it came to digestion. Their diets were simpler: coarse bread, pottage made from barley or oats, and vegetables from their own gardens. They ate little meat and drank ale daily. Their food, though monotonous, was fresher. The danger came in times of scarcity, when desperation drove them to scavenge spoiled stores. During famines, such as those of the early 14th century, people resorted to boiling weeds, bark, or whatever remnants they could find. Chroniclers wrote of villagers eating bread made from acorns and diseased grain, their faces pale and swollen from hunger. Food poisoning in those years wasn't a misfortune, it was inevitable. Among the clergy, food was both spiritual and practical. Monks and nuns followed strict dietary rules, abstaining from meat on certain days, relying heavily on fish and grains. Yet monasteries, for all their discipline, weren't immune to decay. Their cellars brimmed with salted fish, dried peas, and old cheese. The air was damp, the light dim. They believed that moderation, prayer, and fasting could purify the body from within. But foodborne illness respected neither faith nor piety. Monks occasionally recorded outbreaks of mysterious fevers of the stomach, striking entire abbeys after a meal. Medicine, when called upon, could do little. Doctors prescribed vinegar, honey, or herbs to cleanse the humors. Some recommended drinking diluted wine to purge corruption. Others turned to astrology, timing treatments according to the movements of the moon. Few realized that their own hands, their knives, or their water might be carrying the true cause. Even when illness passed, people rarely learned from it. The idea that a stew could contain invisible killers was too foreign, too contrary to their worldview. Food was life, and if it sometimes brought death, that was part of the mystery of creation. They prayed before meals for divine blessing. And if sickness followed, they prayed again for forgiveness. There were attempts, however misguided, at cleanliness. Wealthy kitchens had scullions whose sole task was to wash utensils and wipe down tables. Buckets of sand were used to scrub pots, and herbs like rosemary and thyme were scattered on floors for fragrance. Yet these efforts were aimed more at odor than sanitation. The goal was to smell clean, not to be clean in the modern sense. Despite all the risks, food remained at the heart of medieval joy. Feasts were social events, sacred and binding. Weddings, harvest festivals, saints' days, all were marked by communal eating. The rich displayed their wealth with elaborate dishes, swans roasted whole, pies filled with songbirds, or jellies dyed bright with saffron. The poor gathered around humble stews, singing and sharing bread. Food was never just sustenance. It was identity, pride, and comfort. Even when people fell ill afterward, they rarely blamed the meal. Illness was simply part of life's rhythm, as natural as rain or cold. One of the quietest tragedies of the age was the way ignorance mingled with tradition. Mothers passed down recipes for preserving meat or baking bread, never realizing that their methods sometimes preserved the very danger they feared. Village healers handed out herbal remedies for corrupted stomachs, unknowingly treating symptoms of bacteria they could not see. Yet there was also resilience in this ignorance, a remarkable ability to live with risk, to accept uncertainty as part of existence. In the absence of understanding, medieval people developed habits that, by accident, offered protection. Boiling water for soups and ale killed many pathogens. Fermentation in beer, wine, and cheese preserved food and made it safer. Salting, drying, and pickling extended shelf life. These customs emerged not from science, but from generations of trial and error. Over time, they formed the foundation of European culinary tradition. By the late Middle Ages, cities began to take cleanliness more seriously. Guilds of butchers, bakers, and fishmongers established standards, partly to protect reputations, partly to prevent scandals. Public ovens and markets were regulated more strictly. Physicians, though still guided by humors, began to notice patterns. Certain foods spoiled faster, certain illnesses spread after feasts. Yet the true breakthrough, the germ theory of disease, was still centuries away. For all their progress, people still lived in the shadow of rot. A family might feast one evening and bury half its members by the week's end. Chronicles record episodes of the Great Vomiting, the fevers of the belly, the Black Purge. These phrases described what we would now call outbreaks of foodborne illness, perhaps caused by tainted meat or contaminated wells. Each episode faded into memory, explained by fate, not fermentation. What is remarkable, perhaps, is not that medieval people risked food poisoning, but that they survived it at all. Their immune systems, conditioned from birth, were far more robust than ours. Children drank unclean water and lived. Adults ate food that had sat for days and carried on. Their tolerance to bacteria, and their willingness to eat despite it, was born of necessity. Life was short, and hunger was constant. The luxury of choice simply did not exist. Even so, there was beauty in their meals. A pot of pottage simmering on the hearth, a crust of bread dipped in ale, a handful of berries gathered from the edge of a field. These were moments of peace in lives ruled by uncertainty. The very act of eating was a quiet defiance of the world's dangers. By the time the Renaissance dawned, bringing with it new ideas about anatomy and cleanliness, the old habits began to fade. Glass windows, improved storage, and better urban sanitation slowly transformed kitchens. But for nearly 1,000 years before that, Europe's people lived, and often died, by the food they ate, trusting their senses, their faith, and their luck to carry them through in the end. The story of medieval food poisoning is less about ignorance than about endurance. These people did not understand bacteria, but they understood survival. They faced every meal with the same courage they faced winter, disease, and war, knowing that the body could be betrayed by the very things that kept it alive. So when we wrinkle our noses at the thought of sour aged meat, it's worth remembering that for most of history, this was the taste of life itself. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also human. The next time you open a refrigerator or toss out leftovers, imagine for a moment what it was like to live without such safety. Imagine eating with trust instead of certainty, with gratitude instead of control. That was how medieval people lived, constantly risking food poisoning. And yet, somehow, always finding a way to eat again tomorrow. And that's where we'll leave our journey for tonight, among the flickering candlelight of a medieval kitchen, where every meal was a mixture of hope, habit, and a little bit of danger. It's strange to think how far we've come, from guessing whether bread was safe to eat, to scanning expiration dates on plastic packaging. If you enjoyed drifting through history with me tonight, don't forget to give this video a like. It really helps more sleepy minds find their way here. And if you'd like more calm, quiet stories from the forgotten corners of history, make sure to subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. Until next time, rest easy and dream of gentler centuries.